Summer 1943. The American Midwest. The trucks rolled to a stop beside a line of white wooden barracks surrounded by tidy wire fences. Warm sunlight fell across fields of corn stretching to the horizon, a world away from the jungle battlefields of the Pacific. Dust swirled as the tailgates dropped and 24 Japanese prisoners stepped down in silence, eyes blinking those first moments of disbelief. They had expected cages, shouting, humiliation. Instead, the air smelled of bread and coffee drifting from a nearby mess hall. A phonograph played faint swing music from an open recreation hut. American guards in neatly pressed khaki stood at ease, rifles slung low, faces curious more than hostile. A sign above the gate read simply, "Prisoner of War Camp Number 1001, United States Army." One prisoner noticed picnic tables arranged under the shade of trees. Another saw a baseball diamond marked in fresh lime across a field. Everything appeared wrong, impossible. War had promised capture meant death or torment. Yet here the enemy greeted them with order, food, even music. None spoke aloud, but the thought flickered in every mind. Have we surrendered into kindness? The shock of that realization was only beginning. If history like this fascinates you, the forgotten truths, the untold human moments, then make sure to hit subscribe and turn on the bell icon. When Japanese soldiers surrendered in the Pacific during 1942 and 1943, their decisions defied everything they'd been taught since childhood. The Imperial Army's creed boiled down to a single sentence: surrender is shame. By military code and cultural expectation alike, a captured soldier no longer existed. In training camps across Japan, recruits recited that death, even self-inflicted, was the only honorable end. Many carried a single bullet or a grenade for that purpose. Yet the brutal arithmetic of modern battle eroded ideals faster than dogma could uphold them. On the steaming hills of Guadalcanal, New Guinea, and the Solomons, hunger and disease cornered small Japanese units as surely as American firepower. Dysentery, malaria, and exhaustion left some too weak to fight or die quickly. A few hundreds out of tens of thousands survived long enough to be taken alive, dragged from caves or pulled from sea wreckage. They were stunned not only by defeat, but by breath itself. Every exhalation proof they had broken the final oath of loyalty to the emperor. Their fears were precise. Japanese propaganda had painted Americans as merciless savages who burned prisoners alive or used them in grotesque experiments. Leaflets in army newspapers warned that once captured, a man could expect flaying, mutilation, or execution preceded by ridicule. To become the enemy's display was the ultimate humiliation, so when the first Allied patrols in the Solomons shouted for them to come out, Japanese survivors hesitated between myth and instinct. Some crawled toward water bottles thrown by U.S. Marines. Others waited for brutality that never came. What they met instead were medics bandaging wounds, chaplains offering cigarettes, translators shouting in broken Japanese, "Daijobu, you will live." By war standards, that mercy was radical. In 1942, the United States adhered strictly to the 1929 Geneva Convention on the treatment of prisoners of war. The War Department's directive was explicit: captured enemies must be fed, clothed and guarded with discipline, not vengeance. Washington understood that American treatment of POWs would inevitably be compared to Axis behavior overseas. German labor camps, Japanese executions of Allied flyers, atrocities on Bataan. Military policymakers saw moral consistency as a strategic weapon. If American captors behaved humanely, they would expose the moral rot of fascism more effectively than any leaflet. Between 1942 and 1945, roughly 22,000 Japanese soldiers ended up in American custody, tiny beside the more than 400,000 Germans, but significant in symbolism. They were scattered across an expanding network of domestic camps built from Texas to Wisconsin. Transit began at Pacific outposts, Guadalcanal, Espiritu Santo, Pearl Harbor, before long voyages to the continental United States under Navy escort. Packed into Liberty ships, still weak from captivity, they expected to arrive in dungeons. Instead, they stepped into a geography of abundance unknown even to most Americans. Green farmland, running water, electricity, rows of spotless barracks, and regular meal calls echoing through loudspeakers shaped like factory horns. For men raised under wartime rationing, the first lunch tray was a revelation: beef stew thick with vegetables, white bread, milk, and fruit. Those who tried to refuse soon gave in to hunger. One survivor later recalled, The first bite destroyed everything I'd been taught about Western cruelty. Letters from American guards confirmed the moment's impact. At Camp McCoy in Wisconsin, Sergeant Earl Harrison wrote home, "These Japanese are smaller than I expected and polite as schoolboys. We feed them better than we do ourselves and they can't understand it." This paradox, prisoners treated as guests in a war without mercy, would soon become a measure of America's confidence in its own power. A nation certain of victory could afford compassion, and compassion, when witnessed by its enemies, carried consequences beyond the front line. By 1943, the War Department's prisoner of war branch in Washington had become a bureaucracy of paradox, a military office organized around kindness. Its task was not trivial, housing and processing more than 430,000 Axis prisoners across the continental United States while maintaining absolute adherence to international law. The Japanese contingent was numerically small but politically delicate. Officials understood that each man's treatment would echo far beyond the camps to shape the moral front of the Pacific War. Within months, the United States constructed over 500 POW camps in 45 states, staffed by Army service forces and military police units trained in the Geneva Convention's nuances. Each camp followed the same blueprint: a main gate flanked by watchtowers, barbed wire perimeters, rows of identical barracks, a mess hall, infirmary, recreation yard, chapel, and library hut. At first glance, they resembled small Midwestern towns, a deliberate optical choice. Commanders were ordered to reflect America's civility, not its fear. Propaganda films abroad would show captured soldiers reading, working, even smiling. The message was that democracy looked nothing like fascism. The arrival procedures were precise. Prisoners exchanged tattered field uniforms for laundered denim worksuits with the letters PW stenciled in white across the back. They were photographed, medically examined, and briefed through interpreters on camp rules decomposed into simplicity. Obey, work, and you will eat well. Refuse and confinement replaces comfort. Few refused. At Camp Clarinda in Iowa, agriculture training began within a week. Japanese prisoners who had fought in New Guinea now found themselves harvesting corn beside American civilians. The first day, supervisors placed baskets of apples and fried chicken lunches along the edge of the field. Guards noted bewilderment rather than defiance. They bowed and thanked us like guests, one farmer wrote. Then they ate until there was nothing left. Life inside the camp settled into rhythm. Wake-up bugles at dawn, breakfast lines winding past canteens serving bacon, eggs, oatmeal, and milk. Work assignments, repairing fences, cleaning vehicles, driving tractors, cutting lumber, or tending gardens. Evenings brought organized recreation. Lectures, language classes, and films projected on whitewashed walls. For holidays such as July 4th and Christmas, guards decorated mess halls with flags and streamers. Prisoners watched the festivities through cautious curiosity. American command viewed such programs as multi-layered strategy, part morale management, part soft propaganda, and part preparation for post-war occupation. Every orderly meal, every honest paycheck given for field labor was proof to the world that America's strength resided in discipline tempered by humanity. The contrast with Japan's own prison camps was brutal. Reports reaching Washington through survivors of Bataan, Burma, and the South Pacific described starvation rations, beatings, and tropical diseases unchecked by medicine. The War Department quietly circulated these accounts to troops to remind them why strict adherence to the Geneva Convention mattered. Compassion distinguished civilization from barbarity. Publicly, officials never mentioned the comparison. Privately, they knew its value. Even the appearance of hypocrisy could undermine Allied credibility. By 1944, stories of camp life had begun filtering across the Pacific through captured mail. Japanese censor offices intercepted letters from returning exchange prisoners describing American food, hospitals, and concerts. The tone was disbelief. Translators archly summarized one: "The enemy gives 3 true meals per day. Meat and bread limitless. They play music in yard." The letter circulated quietly among intelligence officers in Tokyo, causing unease. If Americans treated prisoners humanely while Japanese units beheaded theirs, how could indoctrinated soldiers continue to believe imperial virtue outweighed Western corruption? This psychological asymmetry was no accident. U.S. military planners considered humane policy both moral duty and weapon of influence. The more prisoners who survived to tell of America's fairness, the less credible Japan's propaganda became. Orderly compassion therefore occupied an odd position within total war. It served both conscience and strategy. When the trucks rolled into new camps lined with baseball diamonds and bandstands, the spectacle said what no leaflet could. It announced an empire confident enough not to fear empathy. From this foundation of logistics and principle emerges the human story within the wire, days of disbelief that evolved into routine, the culture clash that would reveal America to its captives, and the captives to themselves. For Japanese prisoners arriving from Pacific battlefields, the first week in American camps felt surreal. They had left jungles where starvation and fever were constants, where men boiled shoe leather and drank from puddles slick with oil. Now trays in front of them held butter, white bread, milk, and fruit, luxuries unknown even to middle-class civilians back home. The Camp McCoy mess officer described the first breakfast like a cultural earthquake. They stared, waiting for a trick. Some prisoners refused to eat, believing the food poisoned to mock surrender. After several days, their hunger broke disbelief. What followed were murmured apologies to the cooks and a slow, almost embarrassed enjoyment. Within weeks, small acts of imitation appeared, the way Americans salted their eggs or sweetened coffee. To men raised inside propaganda of Allied barbarism, kindness was cognitively disorienting. It challenged the moral architecture built since their cadet schools. The menu itself became evidence of another world. One former Japanese lieutenant wrote years later that the first apple he tasted in a Wisconsin camp changed his view of the United States more than any classroom lecture. Abundance, not argument, dismantled certainty. It was impossible to hate efficiently fed enemies for long. Every camp reflected the culture of the soldiers who ran it. Citizen soldiers from Kansas, Texas, Wisconsin, each introduced overnight to the paradox of guarding enemies they'd never met on battlefields. Military police wore sidearms but rarely used them. Rifles stayed locked in the towers more for formality than fear. Sergeants learned early that hostility produced chaos, while respect maintained order. The Geneva Convention's rules, drilled relentlessly, worked because they aligned with American self-image. Treating prisoners well confirmed that the U.S. had become moral referee of the modern world. Letters home often conveyed fascination more than hatred. "These Japs are polite and tidy," one Iowa guard noted, "and the smartest workers we've had." Officers encouraged friendly competition in carpentry, gardening or baseball, believing shared routine curbed escape attempts better than barbed wire. They were mostly right. Less than 1% of Japanese prisoners tried to flee. To many guards, mercy felt less like generosity than victory itself. It proved America had enough strength to be gentle. When prisoners watched guards share cigarettes or laughter, it quietly undermined the image of an enemy nation built entirely on cultural hierarchy. In turn, the guards found themselves witnesses to transformation, the gradual softening of captives once framed as suicidal fanatics. They saw not monsters but men. Cultural friction still colored daily life. Early months brought minor explosions of mistranslation, bows mistaken for mockery, shouted orders heard as insults. Interpreters labored to decode subtle gestures, Japanese formality against American informality. Refusal to look directly at guards was misread as arrogance. In fact, it signified deference. Slowly, both sides learned. Religion offered the first bridge. Chaplains circulated among barracks offering English lessons alongside sermons on forgiveness that transcended creed. Muslim, Christian, or Shinto, labels blurred inside the neat rows of beds and steel lockers. The effect was human, not theological. Each conversation reshaped perception. If these devils tolerated belief, maybe they were not devils at all. One documented incident at Camp Concordia showed how fragile yet resilient trust had become. A guard accidentally knocked a prisoner's handcrafted carving to the floor, snapping it in half. The guard apologized in his best Japanese. The prisoner laughed softly and handed him a new piece days later. That simple exchange spread through the compound faster than any order or notice board. Gestures accomplished what propaganda never could. Such interactions, repeated thousands of times across the Midwestern landscape, produced invisible dividends. The captives entered as assets, labor for farms, but they left as witnesses to an unforeseen civility. The next stage of the story would broaden that experience from dining halls to playing fields, transforming mundane recreation into cultural revelation. By 1944, the U.S. prisoner of war system had turned practical morality into industry. Each Japanese captive became a worker compensated through military script, 10 cents a day credited for labor, and assigned simple but vital tasks on farms, sawmills, and road crews. In Iowa and Arkansas, Japanese POWs harvested sugar beets beside German prisoners and American civilians alike. The work softened fear on all sides. Farmers, desperate for help as men left for overseas combat, quickly learned that these former enemies were careful and reliable. Some even traded produce for tiny carved souvenirs. Within the camps, labor meant dignity. Idle hands would have magnified shame. Effort suggested usefulness. Many prisoners rationalized work as penance. If service could not reclaim honor in battle, perhaps rebuilding farms for widows might. U.S. commanders noticed morale in Japanese compounds improved faster than in German ones, perhaps because obedience and self-discipline already harmonized with military expectations. The system turned competitors into contributors and the unease of captivity into the steady rhythm of rural America. Yet economic freedom was only half the revelation. Payment, however modest, included choice. Canteen tokens to buy cigarettes, candy, or stationery. The ability to choose astonished men raised under regimented scarcity. One remembered, "My first decision without command was which soap to buy. I felt human again." That was exactly the psychological victory Washington had hoped for. It was recreation that humanized the ideological battlefield. Camp commanders understood morale was management. A content prisoner was safe, a bored one volatile. America exported its leisure with missionary zeal. Ball fields, bandstands, library huts, even grammar classes. Through open summer windows came the unmistakable crack of bats striking balls. To Japanese ears trained on martial drums, the sound carried mystery. Competition without hate. Baseball had existed in Japan since the late 19th century, but in wartime it had been co-opted for drills and nationalism. Inside American camps it became play again. Photographs show smiling POWs in crafted paper uniforms running bases against teams of guards and local workers. Reporters invited occasionally. To reassure domestic audiences saw friendly games proving the fairness of American custody. Historians would later call these contests some of the most effective. Propaganda never broadcast, music followed the same rhythm of bridge building. Army Special Services supplied instruments. Japanese soldiers formed ensembles blending folk songs with swing. On quiet evenings, the strains of harmonicas and shakuhachi flutes floated above wire fences, merging into a single, unintended anthem of reconciliation. The camps echoed less like prisons than displaced universities. Labor by day, learning and laughter by night. Beyond comfort lay political design. In 1944, the War Department launched the Reorientation Program for Japanese prisoners of war, aimed at laying seeds for future democratization. Classes taught English, civics, and the concept of individual rights. Instructors carefully framed discussions around practical observation rather than ideology. How local elections worked. How newspapers criticized generals without punishment. How guards addressed superiors by first name. For men indoctrinated under Tokyo's wartime absolute authority, these lessons bordered on science fiction, but curiosity replaced defiance. Many enrolled voluntarily. American planners hoped that educated POWs would become post-war bridges. They weren't wrong. Several later entered Japan's Reconstruction bureaucracy, carrying memories of electrified lights that never failed, and guards who shared food without rank privilege. As sociologists observed, their exposure to functional democracy predated Japan's formal surrender by 2 years. In retrospect, every classroom attached to a POW camp looked like rehearsal for the coming occupation. By the final winter of 1944, the collective psychology of captivity had changed. Less prisoners than students. Less humiliation than instruction. Unseen by front lines or propaganda posters, this quiet experiment in humane power had already begun rewriting both nations' understanding of each other. The next section brings that realization into focus, a moment when everyday leisure became revelation, and when captors and captives recognized the moral weight of normalcy. By mid-1944, The vast network of POW camps across the American heartland had transformed from a wartime necessity into an unintentional window into democracy itself. The most vivid collision of worlds occurred that summer at Camp Concordia, Kansas, when heat shimmered across wheat fields and barbed wire glinted like faint silver thread under sunlight. Inside the compound, the Japanese prisoners' routine unfolded as usual. Roll call, breakfast, labor under guard, return for supper. But one July afternoon, an Army recreation officer approached with a clipboard bearing an implausible proposal: a baseball tournament between prisoners and American guards. To the officers in Washington, it seemed harmless morale management. To the prisoners, it bordered on absurdity. In Tokyo, sports had become extensions of discipline. On the front, games had vanished altogether. Yet the Americans insisted. They laid chalk lines, dusted the infield, and produced a battered ball. A prisoner sergeant, formerly a school athlete before the war, volunteered reluctantly to organize his side. The first innings unfolded before curious eyes along the fence, half guarding, half spectating. When the Japanese pitcher hurled a clean strike past an American batter, applause erupted, from both sides. For the first time since capture, laughter outvolumed orders. Guards kept score. Prisoners kept rhythm. The small crowd cheered errors louder than victories. Swing music spilled from the command shack's radio, and somewhere in the stands a harmonica joined in. When the final pitch landed in the outfielder's glove, the Japanese team had lost by a single run. Both teams shook hands instinctively. Cameras clicked. Photographs of 5 smiling players. Their shirts marked PW would later appear in local newspapers captioned, "Friendly game behind the ear, wire." America had managed a public demonstration of virtue without speech or sermon. That simple contest carried weight, measured not in innings but in revelation. The spectators realized confinement could contain freedom. Even the prisoners recognized irony. The same opponent capable of obliterating cities could also share a game with them. Reports from camp administrators later described a decisive drop in hostility. Prisoners began requesting English lessons, volunteering for mixed choirs, or sketching comic scenes of daily life. For many, this day became the emotional turning point of captivity. Until then, survival meant endurance. Afterward, it meant comprehension. Captivity no longer defined identity. Experience did. What the Imperial Army had labeled disgrace now hinted at awakening. The shock of abundance had matured into mutual curiosity. And in that curiosity, the foundations of post-war reconciliation quietly took shape. The next act would illuminate the paradox fully, when these captives, traveling home after surrender, saw America's unscarred prosperity with their own eyes and understood, perhaps for the first time, why they had lost. Summer faded into late 1945. News of atomic destruction in Hiroshima and Nagasaki reached even the smallest camps by rumor, then official bulletin. For most Japanese prisoners, the word surrender arrived not as relief but disbelief. They had imagined dying before this moment. Now the captors they thought temporary became the arbiters of their nation's fate. Across more than 100 American compounds, silence hung between barbed wire rows as loudspeakers carried Emperor Hirohito's unprecedented voice in translation. Men who had not wept when beaten on battlefields wept now. Within weeks came sudden movement. The U.S. Army's repatriation branch assembled trains to carry prisoners from inland camps to coastal ports. At each stop, Kansas, Missouri, Indiana, local bands appeared, children waving flags and curiosity replacing hostility. Guards who had lived alongside captives for 2 years shook hands through railcar windows. Some exchanged photographs and home addresses despite strict orders forbidding correspondence. A few even slipped small gifts, harmonicas, notebooks, baseballs with penciled signatures. To the Japanese soldiers watching America pass by, the real shock began on those journeys. They had lived inside limited compounds and small-town labor projects. Now they saw an entire continent unscarred by war, factories humming, farms thick with harvest, families laughing freely in streets lit after dark. One recollected decades later, "We believed America spent itself on the battlefield. But from the train windows we saw strength everywhere." Another, a former sergeant from the Philippines front, wrote in an interview, "I understood then why we had no chance. We had fought an idea of America, not its reality." At processing centers near San Francisco and Seattle, Departing prisoners lined up for final pay, medical examinations, and photographs. Red Cross officials oversaw each step, ensuring records met Geneva standards. American officers offered parting words through interpreters. Return safely, rebuild your country. The tone was bureaucratic, but the sentiment sincere. Prisoners bowed in gratitude, many embarrassed by how fluent their English had become. When transport sailed westward across a tranquil Pacific, the returning men stood along railings faced with new conflict, relief at survival mixed with dread of homecoming. Letters received through neutral channels had warned that Japan viewed captives as cowards. They expected shame, perhaps ostracism, yet folded among their few possessions, many carried small reminders of a different lesson, framed photographs, American paperbacks, and that most symbolic of objects, a worn baseball signed by both teams of that Concordia game. Those keepsakes turned into secret testimonies. Once back on Japanese soil, former POWs whispered about the unexpected mercy they'd met. To some listeners, it sounded like defeat all over again. To others, especially a younger generation awakened to post-war freedom, it sounded like proof that humanity could survive ideology. In every official sense, the repatriation convoys marked closure. In moral sense, they began something larger. The war that had taught contempt ended with evidence of compassion. For America, those camp years became a case study of victory through virtue. For Japan, they foreshadowed transformation, the possibility that democracy could coexist with honor. The next chapters of history would quantify results: nationwide rebuilding, constitutional reform, a partnership once unthinkable. But inside the memory of those who lived behind wire, the decisive moment had already come. It wasn't the day bombs fell or flags changed. It was the quiet realization aboard trains and ships that mercy, not might, defined the world they were re-entering. When the last repatriation transports reached Japan in 1946, they unloaded men the homeland no longer recognized. The soldiers who stepped onto Yokosuka's docks were healthier and heavier than civilians awaiting them. Many Japanese onlookers stared at their clean uniforms, polished boots, and the small duffel bags stamped U.S. Army. Whispers circulated, traitors fed well in enemy lands. The stigma came quickly. Newspaper editorials labeled them Senryo Nikuta Mono, those fattened in captivity. Families grieved privately that their sons had not died beautiful deaths. The prisoners kept their memories guarded, afraid of being misunderstood. Official repatriation screening by Japan's demobilization ministry confirmed conditions abroad but buried the praise deep within bureaucratic phrasing. Treatment in accordance with international law, morale satisfactory. Between the lines lay extraordinary humane records. Hospitals cleaner than any in Tokyo, calorie counts 4 times wartime rations, death rates among POWs less than 1%. American reports compiled by the War Department proudly echoed those data. In 1947, an internal memorandum from the Office of the Provost Marshal General concluded, "The Japanese prisoner program, small but symbolically important, demonstrated the efficacy of dignity as control. Every photograph of well-fed captives, every inspection log signed by Red Cross observers, was archived as evidence that the United States had behaved as civilization's steward rather than avenger." Inside Japan, however, the moral accounting was slower. Veterans who had endured their own army's brutality began reassessing values once considered immutable. Diaries surfaced recounting camp scenes too strange for public admission, Christmas dinners served with cranberry sauce, American guards teaching English slang, jazz records spinning beside wire fences. Historians later called these recollections subversive memories. They contradicted the myth of national martyrdom. Yet they also helped a humbled society interpret defeat not purely as destruction, but as instruction. Meanwhile, in America, public knowledge of the Japanese POW system remained faint. The larger narrative revolved around Europe, D-Day, and atomic triumph. Still, within military circles, humane custody emerged as moral ammunition in post-war debates. Officers who'd managed Midwestern camps published quiet manuals outlining what they termed discipline through decency. Their methods became templates for future. Cold War prisoner policy, one irony lingered. Some of the same guards who fed and coached Japanese teams returned home to segregated hometowns where equality remained unsettled. The contrast between compassion abroad and prejudice at home illustrated the nation's contradictions, but it also underscored the universality of moral aspiration. The ability to humanize a vanquished foe suggested potential to reform itself. As Reconstruction began under American occupation, rare testimonials reached the desks of officials in Tokyo, translated portions of POW letters thanking the United States for honorable care. General Douglas MacArthur's headquarters quietly circulated them among cultural relations staff. Propaganda had ended. Diplomacy was beginning. When educators drafting Japan's new constitution searched for examples of democratic ethics, they cited, without attribution, those same camp archives to define respect for human rights. What America considered routine bureaucracy, feeding, housing, and instructing prisoners, had become moral precedent inside the very nation it defeated. Out of canteens and baseball games grew an ethos of Reconstruction. The next chapter of this story followed both societies grappling with that legacy. Americans questioning cost, Japanese citizens decoding its meaning. In the years that followed, memories of those camps drifted into the background noise of the booming peace. America turned to prosperity. Japan rebuilt from ash into industry. Yet inside archives and veterans' reunions, the story of humane captivity lingered as testament to principle. Between 1947 and 1950, congressional subcommittees reviewed the cost of maintaining more than 500,000 Axis prisoners on U.S. soil. Reports revealed a moral paradox. Feeding captured enemies had consumed millions of dollars during wartime rationing, but the same policy yielded agricultural output worth even more. In practical terms, the program had paid for itself. In philosophical terms, it had bought something less tangible: reputation. The Geneva Convention no longer looked like idealism. It looked like strength efficiently managed. U.S. soldiers who once served as camp guards discovered their experience had become a quiet credential. When the United States entered new conflicts in Korea and later Vietnam, military planners consulted those old manuals titled Discipline Through Decency. The lessons remained. Order is cheaper than cruelty. Respect is security. The wartime experiment in moral authority evolved into doctrine. In Japan, the subject took longer to surface publicly, but by the 1960s, writers began including POW recollections in memoirs and serialized newspapers. The tone had softened. Where once shame clouded every sentence, now curiosity and gratitude crept in. Former captives spoke of learning English, of seeing democratic debate for the first time, of the shock of American multiracial units and abundant food. Some confessed that their worldview had shifted permanently. A few even corresponded with former guards, sending gifts or letters decades later. Museums in both nations eventually enshrined the artifacts of those unlikely classrooms. Canteens stamped PW, handmade carvings, and faded baseballs signed in both alphabets. Each object carried understated power. They asked quieter questions. Can mercy exist without weakness? Can victory hold meaning without compassion? Those who had lived the answer tended toward simplicity. They had survived because kindness had been codified. At home, however, not every American approved of such liberal memory. During the onset of the Cold War, isolationists derided soft treatment of enemies, arguing that moral example rarely deterred dictators. Yet photographs of healthy prisoners returning to Japan in 1946, kneeling to bow toward their American guards, refuted cynicism more persuasively than any speech. Those images circulated through international relief organizations, shaping early United Nations debates on human rights and post-war Reconstruction guidelines. By the late 1980s, as veterans of both sides aged, academic conferences revisited the POW system as social laboratory rather than footnote. Historians traced how many former Japanese captives later entered civic organizations promoting pacifism or U.S.-Japan friendship societies. What had begun inside barbed wire ended as cultural bridgework spanning the Pacific. The paradox remained visible each. Memorial Day and Hiroshima anniversary. A nation once at war with another now bound by exchange programs and alliances. The roots of that reconciliation grew not only from treaties and diplomacy, but from thousands of quiet interactions. A guard handing coffee to a former enemy, a prisoner singing along to swing music, a shared inning of baseball. The record of those camps endures as evidence that military strength and moral restraint can coexist. It also reveals that history's perception of power changes when weapons fall silent and meals are shared instead. The last word on this story belongs not to generals but to the anonymous men who lived it. Americans who discovered mercy could govern, and Japanese who learned that captivity could teach freedom. The lesson continues in the reflection that follows. History often remembers how wars are fought, not how enemies are treated after the fighting stops. Yet the quiet experiment that unfolded inside America's World War II prisoner of war camps reveals that mercy can be strategy as well as virtue. For the United States, humane custody was a declaration more powerful than propaganda. It told the world that a democracy certain of its strength could be confident enough to feed, educate, and even entertain those who had once sworn to die destroying it. For the Japanese prisoners, that same generosity dismantled myths built over years of indoctrination. Each meal served under a flag of freedom demonstrated that civility was not decadence. It was order, abundance, and faith in discipline without cruelty. When those men returned home, their stories became small tributaries feeding a larger river of transformation. They had glimpsed a society where choice was ordinary, where law restrained vengeance, where soldiers could teach rather than torture. Within a single decade, their nation would rebuild itself on many of those same principles. The baseball fields, mess halls, and classrooms of America's POW system may seem incidental beside Normandy or Iwo Jima, but their moral weight endures. They proved that character is a weapon difficult to measure yet impossible to defeat. Every bowl of soup offered across that cultural gulf was a kind of quiet victory, one that echoed in the peace to come. Today, the same logic holds. Power that spares when it could destroy defines civilization more than any battle it wins. And somewhere in the long archive of the 20th century, among typed reports and faded photographs, lies the truest image of post-war reconciliation. A Japanese prisoner smiling awkwardly beside an American guard, a baseball bat between them, showing that even amid the ruins of war, humanity still knew how to play.